Good morning, church family. Very excited to get into the study of Ruth this morning. Wow. After getting prepared for today's study, I didn't walk away with what I expected to walk away with, and that's a good thing. But I did want to share that with you. Because the book of Ruth, it really surprised me in a lot of different ways, and in fact, in ways that I didn't even think it would. One of the things, and I'm just going to give you a spoiler alert, talks about the idea of a kinsman redeemer. That changes everything for me, and it's really interesting when I start to think about it from that perspective. But let's go ahead and get into class here this morning. And this confidence monitor isn't doing what it should do. So here's by way of introduction. There we go. The last verse in the book of Judges. So go ahead and open your Bibles. Bibles at the ready. Last page of Judges. First page of Ruth. The very last verse that we have says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And the story that we ended off with, or the account that we ended off with, was the account of Samson. And of course, Samson took for himself a wife at the very beginning. In fact, the very first words that Samson says are, "Get her for me, for she is right in my own eyes." And we talked about the fact that that phrase, "every man did what was right in his own eyes," isn't 100% a bad thing. Because if doing what the Lord says is what is right in your own eyes, that's not a bad thing. So we saw Samson, who did what was right in his own eyes, and the irony of that whole situation is what happened to him when he was captured. What happened to his eyes? They were removed, right? So we have that here. But this is the last statement. This is going into Ruth. Now, Ruth, from a chronological standpoint, does not come at the end of Samson or at the end of the Judges, and we're going to see that. But I just want to start off there because this phrase is going to come up in a different way. From the story of Gideon, we pointed out that sometimes it seems when we are needing God's help, instead of giving us the resources he needs, or that we think we need, he tends to take even what we do have away, reducing our resources. And remember, when Gideon was told, "You get for yourself a group of men so that we can take out these Midianites," he got 32,000. And what did God say? Not too many. Okay, so 22,000. He basically says, "Hey, if you're scared, go home." Well, 22,000 took him up on that. And what did God say? Still too many. Reduce it down to 300. And why was it that God did that specifically?
Ability to overcome the enemy himself.
To show his ability and the reliance on him so that nobody could say of himself, "I have done this." Romans 8:28 is a concept that Paul introduces us to when he says, "We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose." And that is going to come into play here, but in a way that I didn't even think about necessarily until after reading through Ruth 40 times. I don't know how many times, but right after you get exposure to this, it's interesting what comes out. And then finally, the New Testament is in the Old Testament contained. The Old Testament is in the New Testament explained. And that's taken from Augustine. It's an Augustine quote. And I love this quote because the end result here, the net result, is when you insert Jesus into the Old Testament, it all makes sense. And yeah, the Old Testament makes sense and it can stand on its own 2 feet because it's a historical document. Why wouldn't it be able to stand on its own 2 feet? But there are things that come out in the Old Testament that when you put Jesus in the middle of the mix, you say, wow, okay, all right, I get it. So, Bible's at the ready. Let's go and let's start off with the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 1 in verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These 2 took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. All right. There is a lifetime of experience contained in these first 5 verses. So we got to talk about what's going on here because it plays out later, and we're going to see that very, very, very well. One thing I do want to point out, and this is from my own reading, so I didn't get this from anywhere. This is how I think of it, and if I'm wrong, well, y'all could tell me. But I feel like Ruth is kind of divided into 2 parts. Chapters 1 and chapter 2 are really about, well, they're about Ruth. It's kind of all centered around in her. Yeah, we get introduced to Boaz, but then chapters 3 and 4 really focus in and hone in on Boaz. From an application standpoint, and because we are putting Jesus in the middle of our studies, what I see the most and what I'm going to encourage you to focus on for today's study is that chapters 1 and 2 are really, I relate to chapters 1 and 2. What is going on and what we see happening in the first 2 chapters really, I feel like, relates to me. And then chapters 3 and 4 are where we really insert Jesus. So that's the approach that we're going to take in today's class. So let's look at the text again. Where are we? We are in, so here's a map of Palestine from the judges' time frame, and this is the area that we're going to be focused on mainly. So you have here kind of a blow-up of the map, and if you look, in Judah, we have Bethlehem. So this is where the story starts. Now look at verse 1. In those days, when the judges ruled, I'm not certain I know which judge is ruling at this time, but what's going on in the land at this time? There's a famine in the land. And you all remember the sin cycle, how it starts off where the Israelites, they lived in relative peace, and then what happened? They sinned, and then after the sin, what happens? They are oppressed. Kind of get a feeling that this is the oppression part of the cycle here, right? Because there's a famine in the land. It doesn't say exactly what the famine in the land could have been. It could have been of natural causes like a drought, right? Would a drought cause a famine? Yeah. Or locusts. That area of the map can be prone to locusts coming in. What else might have caused a famine?
The other nations stealing all their food.
Yeah, somebody coming from Midian and taking all of their food. Whatever the case was, there is a famine in the land. There is no longer any food. But we do have a sense that they could travel a little bit freely, because what happens? How does Elimelech respond to this? the conditions of the famine?
He moves.
What's that?
He moves to a place where they would have food probably.
He moves to a place where they would have food, right? And we're going to get into Moab a little bit here in a minute. But before we talk about the actual move itself, those of us that have moved across the country, let's talk about that a little bit, right? How many of you all have moved across country? Quite a few of us. So we have this experience. And what is one thing that you have to do before you move?
Pack your stuff.
You got to pack your stuff up.
Get rid of your property.
What's that?
Get rid of your property.
You get rid of your property. Right. And how do you do that typically?
You just sell it.
You sell it, right? So what's interesting is let's talk about how you got the property in the first place. 99 out of 100 of us, how did we get our homes? We bought them. We paid for them, right? We bought and paid for them. And so then it makes sense that we're going to sell them, right? The reason I'm bringing this up is how did the children of Israel get their homes? They inherited it, right? And like when we, yeah.
God gave it to them by lot.
Yes. And that's exactly right. That's what we mean when we say they inherited it. So we're not necessarily talking about something that they worked for. It was given to them. And in many cases, with some of the cities and the towns, they were given even the homes that they lived in. They just kind of moved their stuff in. Excuse me. And so now think about it from the perspective of selling said property. It's kind of weird when you think about it from that concept, right? Because what are you doing? You are taking effectively a gift and dispensing of your gift in that way. I want you to remember this, because this is going to come back to play later. Yeah.
Are you going to talk about the rightness and the wrongness of what they did?
Yes. Not right now. Not yet. But, yeah.
Let me just make this observation.
Okay.
I don't think I would recognize this until actually with my own eyes saw the land of Moab.
Mm.
It is so desolate. That's where they filmed the movie The Martian. It's just a red rock. I mean, weeds don't even try to grow.
Right.
So, to put it into our vernacular that we can understand, it's like, okay, they left the breadbasket and they moved to Death Valley.
Yes.
Like, okay, how's that working out for you?
Right. So, and I appreciate that, because names mean a lot, especially in the book of Ruth. You could do a whole study of names. We're gonna hit the peaks of it. So I appreciate that, because Craig said something. They left the what? The bread basket. What does Bethlehem mean? House of bread. And why are they leaving? Because there's no bread. There's a famine, right? So you do have this play out, and there is an irony here that we can see. And first off, you have to go back to the sin cycle, because that oppression piece means there's something definitely wrong if you're in the house of bread and you're not getting bread. So they leave. But they sell everything that they own, but what they own was really given to them as an inheritance. It was allotted to them by tribe, and they're in the tribe of Judah. And so that's the dynamics. Now, think about it from Naomi's standpoint. I know my wife takes a lot of pride in how well the house is set up. And when the house is not set up is when it's in boxes. And so getting stuff out of boxes is the one thing that has to happen. So she's packing everything, and they are moving from Bethlehem to Well, they're not moving across the country, because remember I asked how many of us have moved across country? How many of us have moved intercontinentally, right? Okay, a little bit less of us, but that's a difference altogether, right? Even traveling to a different country is gonna hit you a little bit differently, because now you're in a place where maybe they don't even speak your language. The stores all look different. The people all act different. The places of worship, maybe, are different. I can't help but think about my time in India. And I wasn't there very long, only 5 days. But their places of worship were significantly different than our places of worship. The gods that they worship are different. All right, so they move, and what happens? It seems almost instantaneously. I don't know how much time had passed, but when they get to Moab, what happens? Elimelech, the husband, the one who said, "Hey, let's go," he dies. And so now you put yourself in the shoes of Naomi, but she still has her 2 boys, right? So they don't leave Moab. They stay there. In fact, they stay there long enough for what to happen? For the 2 boys to get married. And the scripture says that they stay there 10 years. A little bit of perspective on my part, that's how long my family's been here in Wisconsin. We have been here 10 years. So you have this. Now let's continue with our word study. Elimelech. His name means God is king. The 2 sons. The 2 sons, I saw lots of different translations for their names, so I don't know how necessarily accurate this is, but the one that kept coming up for the 2 boys, Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon, sick or sickly, and Chilion, wasting or consumption. Not in terribly, my name, and it's funny because me and Lauren have the same name, it means crown. So that makes me happy. I'm like, hey, yeah, Laurel, that's awesome. Go for that. But, think about my name means sick or sickly. My name means wasted. Naomi. Naomi's name means pleasant or sweet or sweetness. That's going to come into play here in a little bit. And then we'll get into the others. So they leave the house of bread. They go to the land of Moab. They have left. Elimelech dies. They settle there. Boys get married. Then both boys die. So what's the dynamic now? 3 single women.
And they have no income because you need a man to have an income.
Right. They have no income. They are destitute. And if you think about if that were to happen here in the United States of America, well, there's a lot of things that would be a lot different. But the mother-in-law living with her 2 daughters-in-law, what would the 2 daughters-in-law most likely do? They'd go home. They'd go back to their parents' house. That's not the case in 100%, and I understand that. But the matriarch now, the leader, really, becomes Naomi. And so we need to read on to see what happens. So this is talking verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. They left the house of bread. They're in Moab. All the men have died. And now she hears tell of what? Famine's over. Food is back. So she makes the decision to move back effectively to Bethlehem. So she doesn't even go straight back to the promised land. She goes all the way to Bethlehem. Verse 7, so she set out from that place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as he has dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them and lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, to go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should say I have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marriage? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. I want to point out two things from this reading. What does Naomi say about her plight at the end of verse 13?
That God has gone forth against her.
That God has come against me. Whenever bad things happen, okay, so now we're getting to the Gideon story here, right? And they were in trouble at the very beginning of the chapter. There was a famine, they were hungry, they left. Now, not only have they left, now Naomi is sitting in a place where she doesn't have a husband or her sons or anything. So she makes this interpretation. The Lord has gone out against me. Typically, when bad things happen, what is a response that we sometimes see? Why is this happening to me? Or, God is mad at me. And what is a response that we sometimes see when that's the conclusion? I'm mad at God. I can't stand what he's doing. Yeah.
We blame God for a lot of our problems. We
Yes.
said, "God, why did you let this happen to me?
Yeah.
Why did you cause this to happen to me?"
And we'll have those internal conversations. Those conversations, because think about the pain that Naomi is going through. This isn't passive, and I don't think that we can kind of brush over this. This is a major life event. Moving across the country is a major life event. Moving across the country to a different country is a life event. Losing everything you have. So you see what's going on here. And can you see, later, we're going to read about it, but what does Naomi call herself? Mara, which means bitter. All right? I'm going to wait. Okay. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Now's the time. She calls herself bitter. And you might be tempted to think she's bitter at God. In fact, turn over there to what, let's see, verse 20. She gets back to Bethlehem, and they say, "Hey, I remember you, Naomi, right?" "No, don't call me that. Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" She sounds bitter. Now, you take that in perspective and what we're kind of talking about here, that sometimes when bad things happen, we might want to blame God, or we might want to get bitter against God and say, "God, why are you doing this to me?" Because is God going to be necessarily the one you're going to want to turn to? Right? You don't know where you're going to turn. But I want you to examine Naomi's faith. This is what hit me this past week. Turn back to chapter 1. Chapter 1 and verse 8. Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you. She wishes a blessing on her daughters-in-law. And she wants that blessing to come from where? From Yahweh. Is it all caps in your translation?
Yes.
From Yahweh. May the Lord deal kindly with you. Look at verse 9. The Lord, Yahweh, that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. So her bitterness, because even before she says how bitter she is, before she says the Lord has dealt harshly with me or he has turned against me, I don't get the impression that she is blaming God from the perspective of, why are you doing this to me? I am so mad at you. Because she still wants the Lord to deal kindly with her daughters-in-law. Did y'all catch that? That is so mature and so faith-filled when I read the words of Naomi here. Look at verse 15 now. Let's continue on the story. Chapter 1. Naomi is speaking. Orpah has left. Orpah said, okay, so we're probably somewhere around here on the border of Moab. Oh, maybe this, oh no, there it is. There, let's just imagine we're here at Zoar. They're on the borders of Moab. She has this conversation and says, turn back. Well, one of the daughters-in-law turns back. Orpah. And I didn't look her name up. I could have, but I didn't, right? So Orpah turns and she says, okay. She still loves Naomi, but she takes her advice and she goes back. So we don't have the sense that like Orpah was like, see ya. It's more like, okay, I will take your advice. Maybe the Lord will bless me. Enter Ruth, and she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said, no more. It is so hard for me to read those words, but I want to read it in the Old English. New King James. Verse 16. Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Let's go older. Let's go New King James. Entreat with an I, not an E. Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. There's a reason why I wanted to read both of those translations. Because the old King James, whither thou goest, I will go. Have you all heard the song? Whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, my God. Whither thou goest, I will go. I love that song. When do we usually hear that?
At weddings back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Weddings back in the 60s. And I grew up with a lot of kids who had parents from the 60s. So I went to a lot of weddings and even performed in a lot of weddings. That very song. Because why is that an appropriate wedding song? It's a song of commitment. The New King James Version, there's a song, and if you all want to do this, either here or in the live stream, but not now, YouTube, Entreat Me Not to Leave. And you will find, if you look hard enough, there's a song that takes the words from the New King James, Entreat Me Not to Leave You. And it is an amazing rendition. So when we talk about you teach and you encourage with song, I really do get encouraged by those two songs. And it is phenomenal what you see there. Now I do want to point out here, look at verse 17. Look at the second half of verse 17. It's interesting what Ruth says. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. What do y'all think about when you see those words? What does that mean? And can you tell me where we first see that? Yes.
Well, all I can see in that is that Ruth is committed to taking care of Naomi.
Yes, Ruth is very committed to taking care of Naomi. In fact, what is the one thing that she is saying that will separate us? Death. Which is probably why we talk about it from the perspective of a wedding, right? Because in the wedding vows, what do you usually say? Till death do us part. That's what Ruth is saying. But let's look even deeper. Where would those words come from? And what does it mean, the Lord do so to me and more also? Michael.
It was the covenant between Abraham and Yahweh.
Yes. Can you describe what happens there? It's in Genesis chapter 15.
Is that when the animals are divided into two sections?
Mm-hmm. How are they divided?
That's God's promise to Abraham, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so God promises Abraham that he will fulfill, he will be faithful to his promise, and the animals are divided, indicating what will happen to them if they break the covenant.
So when you say divided, I think you're being a little kind here, because we're not talking about divide them like the Noah's Ark. They were divided 2 by 2, right? We're talking about they would take them stem to stern, fillet an animal open, and they would lay one piece here and one piece here, and there would literally be blood flowing through. It is called a blood oath, and that was the oath that God made to Abraham about the land, the seed, and the nation. And the idea is, you take this animal, you cut it down the middle, you lay it on either side, and you walk through these two animals laying out there. And when you get to the other side, you turn around and you look to the person that you're talking to, and you say, the Lord do so to me, and more also, if I fail to fulfill my part of the covenant.
And Jewish custom still does that at Jewish weddings, not the cutting an animal part, but when you see them stomp on a glass at the end of a wedding,
Yeah.
that is that same symbol of it can't be undone.
Right?
So it's a tradition that still carries on within the Jewish custom.
That's exactly right. But the idea that it carries is that I'm not just pinky promising here, right? This isn't like I've got my fingers crossed behind my back and I'm going to pinky promise you, so we're not going to really take it seriously. This is what I am saying cannot or should not be undone. And if it is, the consequences for me, the promise maker, are going to be horrendous. I'm saying this to my own ruin, even. I don't know if a blood oath actually took place here, because typically what it would be is they would take a dove. I don't know if Ruth did that, but she is familiar with the covenant, that this form of making a promise. And she also says something very interesting. She says, your God will be my God. Now I want to start to examine the faith of Ruth. Because think about it. So Ruth is a Moabite. Anybody know what the god of the Moabites' name was? Nice and loud if you know it.
Moloch?
What's that?
Moloch?
No?
Dagon?
No? Chemosh. Chemosh. And we have here the Mesha steel or the Moabite stone. This is in the Louvre. And Chemosh is specifically mentioned here. It is in a battle. This is from Moab, and this is with one of the kings. And I have his name written down here somewhere. One of the kings in the divided kingdom, this Mesha steel talks about. But the operative point here, and if you want to know the name of the king, I'll give that to you. Just can't flip to the note right away. It credits Chemosh with the victory over this king for the Moabites. And so this is the God that Ruth would have grown up with. And think about what Ruth has experienced now. She married into a family, and either she married into the family when Elimelech was there, or she married into the family when it was just Naomi and her 2 sons. But when she marries into the family, she loses her husband. So she's very similar to Naomi, only she hasn't moved yet. Naomi's moved, Ruth hasn't. Can Ruth maybe fall into this category of bitterness? Right? And what is she doing? She's just left her husband. She is leaving her country, her kinsmen. And what does she say? Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Naomi, I get it. You just finished, number one, you put a blessing on me from Yahweh, and then you told me that Yahweh has dealt bitterly with you. Later, we're going to see her, Naomi, reciting to the people, don't call me sweetness anymore. Call me bitterness. Because of this Yahweh. That's the God that Ruth is saying. He's going to be my God. Because Naomi hasn't forsaken God. Yahweh is still her God, regardless of how bitter she is. And now Yahweh has become Ruth's God. All right. We're ready for, yes?
I just want to say, you see that Naomi is a wonderful woman because Orpah didn't want to leave her.
Yeah.
She cried because she had to go home. And Ruth doesn't want to leave her. She must have been a very good woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, when she gets back to Bethlehem, how long have they been gone? At least 10 years. And they still remember her. They still know who she is. She made an impression enough that when she gets back, they're like, hey, I remember sweetness. I remember you. Right? Okay. Now, enter Boaz. Y'all know what Boaz means? The Lord has made me strong. Oh, there goes that bell. Okay. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and gleaned in the fields after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field that belongs to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Let's pause right there. I have written next to that verse itself, Leviticus chapter 19 in verse 9. Leviticus chapter 19 in verse 9 is where we can see that the Lord made provisions for this very situation. Somebody who comes in who doesn't have food. There was food made available for them because as they were plowing a field, and I imagine it was pretty similar to the same that we see in today's agricultural world, where they would plow through a field, but they would leave the corners. And if Drew were here, I'd talk about pheasant hunting, because that's where you're going to find some pheasants in the late season, is in those little corners where there's still brush that's growing up, there's still crops that are there, right? Pheasant like to hide there. At least they did when I went. She goes to these corners because they were left. And we can see that she starts to glean. Now, it's the barley harvest. Barley is known as the poor man's food. It was the harvest that happened before the wheat harvest. And so she starts to glean among that. And Boaz comes up. Verse 4, behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Wouldn't that be cool if maybe Brother Craig were to get up before worship from here on out and look out at us and say, the Lord be with you, and everybody else to say, the Lord bless you. This is an employer-employee relationship. If you manage people, when was the last time you looked at the people you're managing and said, the Lord be with you, and then they said, the Lord bless you? Right? Such a relationship. Now, during the Judges, when every man did what was right in his own eyes. And what do we see Boaz doing? Number one, we see him following the old law, leaving that portion of the field for the poor people to glean from. It's not the most economic decision. If you want the most bang for your buck and to pinch every penny and squeeze every last bit of worth out of your field, you are not going to leave the corners. He does. And he greets his people. The Lord be with you. And he has them at a point where they are responding back in kind. This is during the period of the Judges. They are going through the sin cycle, but that doesn't describe every last person in the land of Canaan. There are faithful people, and Boaz is among them. He is a wealthy man, blessed by the Lord, and he continues in this blessing to the Lord. Did he suffer from the famine? Yeah, probably. He probably had some food issues going on here, but he is faithful. Last, what I want to point out here. Boaz, when he sees Ruth, he says, who is that girl? I got to know about her. And they say, this is Naomi's daughter. And I want to read to you what Boaz says he knows of Ruth, and then we're going to have to stop because we're going to run out of time. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter, this is verse 8, do not go and glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field they are reaping and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? Oh, look at this. She asked, why have you found favor? Verse 11, Boaz answers her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and come to a people that you did not know. Look at what he says here. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. We're going to stop. We're going to end right there. Ruth chapters 3 and 4 next week. Enter Boaz.